7 years have passed, yet the story still moves like a cold draft through the corridors of true crime history. Time has softened nothing. If anything, the silence has grown sharper, cutting through the public's memory each time the what's name resurfaces. And now, with distance from that summer morning in 2018, the narrative shifts. Not because the facts have changed, but because the weight of them finally settles into place. 7 years later, the truth, the real truth, the human truth, demands to be spoken aloud. The story doesn't begin in a courtroom or in a confession room. It begins in the quiet hours before dawn, in a home that once held birthday candles and bedtime songs. A home that would become a hollow chamber of unanswered questions. On August 13th, that quiet suburb awakened to the absence of Shannon Watts and her two daughters, Bella and Celeste. Their disappearance wasn't yet a headline. It was a whisper carried by a worried friend and a neighbor who sensed something was terribly wrong. As officers stepped into the house, nothing seemed broken or chaotic, just strangely still. It felt as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. And in that stillness lived the unspoken truth. Sometimes evil announces itself not with violence, but with calm. 7 years later, we revisit these moments not for shock, but for clarity. For the understanding that truth is never a single statement or a single confession. It is the accumulation of choices, lies, omissions, and moments ignored. What Chris Watts said then is one version. What remains when we look back now is another. And the space between those versions is where the real story waits. If you want to journey deeper into the truth behind the silence, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for Dark Matters True Crime, where the shadows are examined, not avoided. Texted coworkers with casual updates, visited job sites, and carried himself with the rhythm of a man following a script written in haste, but delivered with unsettling confidence. But the truth always leaves residue. Detectives noticed immediately that the house felt staged. Beds made too neatly, rooms unnaturally quiet, Shannon's belongings untouched. The neighbor's security footage contradicted Chris's movements. His emotional responses, flat, calculated, nagged at investigators who had seen too many guilty men hide behind the same mask. Then there was the digital trail. Deleted messages, secret apps, and search history patterns that painted a profile of a man preparing to sever himself from his old life. The affair he tried to conceal became a catalyst. One that stripped away the veneer he fought to maintain. When Chris finally confessed, the cover-up shattered, revealing what investigators already sensed. The truth had been sitting in plain sight, humming beneath every lie he attempted to construct. To continue down this path of truth, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for Dark Matters True Crime, where the shadows of this case continue to unfold. When the truth finally ripped through the seams of Chris Watts's carefully constructed lie, the legal machinery moved with a force that felt both inevitable and devastating. The courtroom became the place where illusion died. 7 years later, the proceedings still echo, not because of dramatic outbursts or contested arguments, but because of the suffocating weight of what was already known before the first word was spoken. Prosecutors presented a case shaped by clarity, not confusion. They had the digital footprints, the surveillance video, the forensic evidence, and the confession that spilled out once the pressure of his deception became unbearable. In the end, there was nothing left for Chris to fight. His guilty plea came swiftly, almost quietly, as though the final act of a man who had run out of stories to tell. He pleaded guilty to multiple counts of murder, including the deaths of his pregnant wife and his daughters. Charges weighted with the full gravity of their lives. The courtroom, usually a place of arguments and counterarguments, became instead a solemn chamber of acknowledgement. There was no trial, no lengthy battle, just the cold acceptance of what he had done. The judge delivered 5 life sentences, 3 consecutive, 2 concurrent, ensuring that Chris would never again touch freedom. There was no death penalty on the table. Prosecutors spared the family from reliving the horror through a drawn-out capital case. 7 years later, the sentencing remains a stark reminder that justice can feel both absolute and insufficient. The law answered with permanence, But the losses it sought to address were immeasurable. The truth had spoken, loudly and irrevocably, but even truth can feel too small in the shadow of such a crime. In the months and years that followed the sentencing, the emotional landscape left behind was jagged. Raw in places where healing had barely begun, scorched in others where it would never fully return. 7 years later, the echoes of this crime still ripple through the families and communities who once orbited around Sean and Bella and Celeste. Their absence became a permanent outline, shaping every gathering, every memory, every attempt to move forward. Shannon's family carried the impossible task of grieving a daughter and grandchildren while navigating a world that suddenly wanted answers, interviews, explanations. They didn't ask for the spotlight. It landed on them like debris from an explosion. Their pain became public record, their heartbreak replayed in slow motion for the world to dissect. And yet, even in grief, they held onto the memory of who Shannon was, not how she died. Her voice, her drive, her relentless love for her children became the anchor that kept their sorrow from consuming them whole. Years later, the truth carries a different weight. It hangs in the air like a dense, unmoving fog, something you don't walk through so much as something that settles on you. Because the truth of this case didn't end with a confession or a sentencing. It grew in the aftermath, in the strange territory where the public's morbid fascination met the family's desperate need for privacy. And out of that collision came the questions that still linger today. In prison, Chris began offering new versions of the story, confessions rewritten, details altered, motivations reshaped. Each retelling contradicted the last, creating a labyrinth of shifting narratives. Psychologists called it self-preservation. Investigators called it manipulation. Others saw it as the last shred of control he still possessed. But the effect was the same. The truth became tangled, distorted by the man who had already erased so much. 7 years later, people still ask why. Not in the abstract, but in the painfully specific sense. Why this crime? Why this family? Why this absolute annihilation of the life he built? And the answers, if they exist at all, live somewhere between psychological unraveling and cold, deliberate choice. The truth also shifted for the survivors. Shannon's family confronted a torment few can imagine. The knowledge that Chris continued to speak, to give interviews, to shape narratives about the people he destroyed. They confronted rumors, conspiracy theories, and strangers who tried to rewrite the case for entertainment or shock value. Their grief became something they had to protect. 7 years later, the truth is not a single statement. It is a constellation. Some pieces bright, some obscured, all part of a night sky that will never fully clear. And the question that remains is whether Chris himself even knows the unbroken truth, or whether he buried that alongside everything else. To stay with us as we reach the final chapter, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for Dark Matters True Crime. 7 years later, we stand at the edge of a story that still refuses to settle. The facts are known. The sentences are final. The confessions, however shifting, have been spoken. And yet the case of Chris Watts remains one of those rare tragedies that continues to whisper long after the courtroom doors closed. Not because there is more evidence to uncover, but because the human mind struggles to reconcile the simplicity of the truth with the enormity of the loss. The truth is that no new story has emerged to change what happened. No hidden reports, no sealed files waiting to explode. What remains now is reflection. A long, steady look at how an ordinary life can conceal extraordinary darkness. The truth he speaks now from behind concrete walls is no clearer than the truth he offered in 2018. Time has not granted him wisdom, only distance. And perhaps that is why the case still feels unfinished. Not because of hidden facts, but because the explanation for a crime like this will never feel complete. In the aftermath of 7 years, the real truth belongs not to Chris, but to the memory of Sean and Bella, Celeste, and unborn baby Nico. Their lives, full of color, noise, love, and hope, are the parts of the story that time does not erode.